Hands up, don't shoot. 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 Hello, my name is Krishan Stewart, and I'm going to speak to you about a problem that persists today that I felt was important while taking Capstone 2. It's still important today, and what I think could be a possible solution to work on getting rid of or reducing this problem. The problem that I am going to talk about is youth, but in more particularly African American youth, having poor relationships with law enforcement due to recent events across the nation and because of history in general. Historically, African Americans have always faced some type of discrimination. Have you ever been discriminated against? Think about that. We say everything is equal now, but realistically, discrimination still exists. The hands up, don't shoot chant stems from the Black Lives Matter group. If you haven't heard of them, you could Google them, but I'm pretty sure most of us have heard of them. And that chant is what they said while they were protesting the unjust killings of African American teens and adults, both male and female, by law enforcement. You're probably wondering what this man is asking when he holds up this sign that says, "Am I next?" For one, he has a raised fist, which is common to the Black Panthers. That was how they protested back in the day. Am I next? What is he next for? What do you think he's next for? Are you familiar with breaking news stories across the nation where people of color have been brutalized and even murdered by law enforcement for reasons that seem completely unjustified? This young man is wondering if he will be the next victim. Why? Because of his skin color. Youth and other individuals are often targeted because of their looks, and this creates an attitude of, excuse my language, but fuck the police. I say it so raw and bluntly because the conversations need to be had without sugarcoating. We are often too afraid to have these conversations. These youth see outrage and protest and violence, so their defense is having this attitude and fear of trusting the police. When they encounter police, the air is tense sometimes, and law officials even have their own stereotypes because of a few bad apples within the bunch. I feel like everyone is just has their guard up and they're trying to protect themselves. But no one should walk around every day fearing for their life, wondering if they will be the next victim at the hands of law enforcement for unjust reasons. So what is the problem? The problem between African American youth and law enforcement. So, African Americans, both adults and young people, feel like they are more likely to be hassled by police even when they did nothing wrong. And that's a quote from Hurst et al., 2000. The relationship between youth and the law suffer because of this mentality and because youth resist being around law enforcement. The two feel like they cannot trust each other. According to Watkins and Mom, 2012, research has found that youth generally hold less favorable opinions of the police than do adults. These are facts from research. What are we as a society doing wrong? How can we change their opinion? What are we doing for our youth to make them feel comfortable around the police? So, what caused this problem exactly? Well, there is no one direct cause, but a key cause of this problem is just negative perceptions and interactions of law enforcement. Three contributors towards the problem of these broken relationships between youth and law enforcement is one, the lack of clear communication, two, the lack of cooperation and understanding, and three, insensitivity. So, the lack of clear communication could be the orders from police officers and the response from the teen or adult. The lack of cooperation and understanding could be, for one, that someone may have a mental disorder or they don't have the ability and capacity to follow the instructions. And the lack of cooperation could also be because they're just being stubborn and they do not like the police. So that's why this is a problem. And the insensitivity, although my slide says sensitivity, I want to point out that some people are insensitive. And that can make them feel like they don't have to relate to you and that's already their attitude in their head. And this makes it hard for law enforcement to do their job. Law enforcement depend on the public, which is us, in order to effectively perform their job. And if there is a mistrust between youth and law enforcement, that may become difficult. So both sides are affected. When youth have a negative attitude towards law enforcement, this has been a problem for many years and seems to have only gotten worse. It stems from racism, racial profiling, seeing loved ones being arrested or murdered, and a negative interaction. All of those can contribute to long-term resistance of police by our youth. The exercising of discretionary power by police often puts racial and ethnic minorities at a disadvantage automatically. This picture is important to me. It says, Black youth are not thugs. I feel like the public and media showing the resistance and not the positive of African Americans will have most of the world looking at African American, or as the picture says, Black youth, as thugs, vigilantes, or violent, when that's not always the case. How would you feel if you were judged by the profession you have? How would you feel if people labeled you killers and abusers just because you wear a uniform? So imagine if you were an African American kid being called a thug just because of your skin color. You all depend on the public in order to effectively perform your job. And if there is a mistrust between youth and yourselves, that may make your own job more difficult. So if a child comes into the doctor's office, they might resist you, which does sometimes make your job more difficult because you have to make them comfortable and trust you. Same with the dentist, even with the teacher. So it's not always just a resistance towards law enforcement, it's towards many professions. And the resistance between youth and law enforcement has been a problem for many years, and it seems to only keep getting worse. So we have to figure out how to work together and change that. What are some current approaches that you can think of that in your own neighborhoods that law enforcement has taken to build relationships with the community? It doesn't have to be just with the children. It could be with the community as a whole. One current approach that was found in research was a program known as Side by Side, and that is a program to get police to formally and informally interact with youth to help their attitudes towards each other. The program's mission and one of its goals is to increase the number of police officers who are experienced with and comfortable interacting with youth and improve youth attitudes toward police. And that comes from the Lee article. In my own community, we're also doing similar events and programs like this where law enforcement goes out into the community and has fun with the kids at a park or their community centers. It's just creating that positive presence to try to get their attitudes to change, which is great. This next slide shows a bar chart of groups most likely to be killed by law enforcement. And yes, I said groups most likely to be killed by law enforcement. You can see that there is African American, Native American, Latino, and then different brackets of age groups. And then there's also one that just says average, all races and ages. The highest group is African American, ages 20 to 24. What is your race and age? I am African American and I am 25 years old, and that is the fourth group most likely to be killed by law enforcement. What about you? Perhaps you don't see your race nor age group. Why do you think that is? Do you fear law enforcement? Personally, I get nervous in the car around law enforcement. I haven't been pulled over, but there's been many cases where African Americans have been pulled over and have been killed during police stops. So it makes me a little bit nervous, but I don't have this resistance towards police, but it makes you more aware and kind of standoffish in a way. Like you want to be on your toes for everything. You don't want to make any sudden movements or say the wrong thing because you don't know what the law enforcement is going to do. This picture comes from one of the Black Lives Matter protests. It shows an individual speaking into a mic, and if you look closely behind him, the sign that's being held up says, "Enough is enough. Justice for our people." It has 3 names written on there too. Those are 3 public cases. Freddie Garrett Gray, Sam Dubois, Philando Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Alton Sterling, Jamar Clark, Jeremy McDowell, William Chapman II, Walter Scott, Eric Harris, Tamir Rice, Akai Gurley, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, and Stevante Clark. I just read you a list of names. These are names from high profile and public cases where law enforcement has killed or shot unarmed African Americans unjustly. Some of these officers received consequences and others did not. I do not personally have a connection to any of these people except we have the same skin color. I am black. All of these people were black. And the last name that I said, Stevante Clark, is important to me because this happened in one of my local communities, 15 minutes from my home. He was shot to death in his own backyard, unarmed. He was taking a cell phone out of his pocket, and they assumed it was a weapon, and they shot more than 20 times, which is kind of upsetting. So I said their name because most often law enforcement does not say their name. So you will often hear, say their name, say his name, say her name, and they will not. The victim or the suspect. So remember, these were people too. So what do I recommend to help rebuild relationships between you and officers, or even just to strengthen them? I recommend that all law enforcement members go out and spend more time in the communities of African Americans to display positive interactions with them and the community. You all can help break down the resistance from youth by establishing a good rapport and relationships. Go out and hold events at local parks, visit neighborhood schools, and open up to visits to the local police offices. These kind of activities can help youth become more comfortable with approaching and being approached by all members of law enforcement. And if the youth have resistance, I don't think you should give up on them. Don't fight fire with fire. Don't resist them because they resist you. Because more times they're probably just scared, and maybe that's the attitude they see at home. So maybe you personally invite them, invite their parents. And us as members of the community, we have to be better role models for our children. We should not down talk the police in front of them because they are one of our first responders. Communities of color are not the enemy. So I wrote this. Well, I didn't write this. I found this picture with the hands up in the stance of hands up, don't shoot, because I want all of you to leave here today after listening to my presentation to know that communities of color are not the enemy. I want our strategy to be so effective that youth of color know that law enforcement stands behind them and by their side, and therefore they are on the same team. And this last slide is refers to all of the references and quotes I used during my presentation. If you would like more information or to follow up on any of the information I used in this presentation, I have provided this list. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.